Qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, dona nobis pacem.
Today we're starting in chapter 6, and we're going to cover parts 1 through 4 of 7 parts within the chapter. And our chapter, again, is the conversion of the barbarian tribes. I'd like to read to you a quotation from Blessed Pope John Paul II in a homily he gave in Benin in 1993. Blessed John Paul said this: God desires the salvation of everyone. In a mysterious but real way, he is present to all. Humanity forms one single family, since all human beings have been created by God in his own image. All have a common destiny, since they are called to find fullness of life in God. So then, let's look at the church's mission, its role, conversion, and in this case, the early conversion of the barbarian tribes. So, the church in her forming comes to understand that the work of conversion is going to take place now as the Roman Empire is falling apart. The empire has been the vehicle for the establishment of the church, but now this new chapter is opening as that empire is collapsing. Western civilization, as we know it, is changing, and the empire is no longer going to be the vehicle for the promulgation of the church. So the church recognizes that she has this task to spread the gospel to all lands and all times in all people. That effort to kind of convert the whole of Europe is going to take from the 4th to around the 11th century. Christian missionaries of the time brought the message of God's love made manifest in Jesus Christ with a fervent passion to the peoples of the uncivilized world. The great evangelizers wanted to share the gospel of Christ. They wanted to give them the same gift that they had themselves received. So, in this process, we're going to look at a number of men and women who brought the message to the ignorant. We're going to look at the conversion of the church in Germany. A people who were brutal, who believed in the Arian heresy, that is, that Jesus was not fully man. And it was a huge error to overcome. It was very difficult. After the fall of the Roman Empire, bishops, in an attempt to protect their flock, made the mistake of getting into the political life and started assuming secular power along with their ecclesial authority. And as you can imagine, that brought great problems to the church, and we'll talk about that to a degree. So the church, in her really not all that old, maybe her childhood as it were, is faced with this immense task to spread the word of God in the midst of chaos. The empire is crumbling, the hordes are invading, the boundaries are collapsing, and so they have to bring the lofty, beautiful ideal of Jesus Christ and his gift of salvation to the world, to a temporal organism that is not in the least willing to accept it. A task which clearly, on a human level, on a temporal level, is impossible. It was daunting at best, and in the power of the Holy Spirit, through means that to us may seem strong, men and women of the time went forward and brought out the heart of the church, brought that work of conversion to the barbarian hordes and the barbarian tribes in some rather phenomenal ways. In particular, what was very clear is the church figured out early on that the way to the heart of a country is through a holy queen. Interesting, isn't it? That the ecclesial leaders at the time would find a queen in the country or within the kingdom and work with her to convert her husband, who would then lead to the conversion of the country, and that will be the tale time and again. Let's then look first at France. Unlike any of the other invaders into the Roman Empire, France was not Christian in any way, shape, or form when Gaul was settled in 485. The Franks, however, when they converted, would become the greatest defenders of the church over the course of history. And so let's look at the initial conversion of Gaul. Saint Clotilda, a beautiful Christian Burgundian maiden, was introduced by the local bishop to a Frankish chief named Clovis, and they marry. While Clotilda works to feverishly convert Clovis to the faith, but their first child dies. Then their second child very nearly dies, and Clovis's opinion of the Christian God is diminished significantly. But during a campaign in 496 and 497, Clovis is battling the Alemanni and is facing defeat. And as you might expect, he reaches out to the Christian God and comments that if he defeats the Alemanni, he will convert. In 497, at the Battle of Tolbiac, the Franks indeed do beat the Alemanni. And faithful to his promise that very year, Clovis presents himself to the Bishop Remigius at Reims, along with 3,000 of his troops for conversion, for baptism. And by this baptism, the Franks, as a people, were the first Germanic tribe to embrace the faith. Clovis then continued to conquer and annex neighboring Germanic tribes, one of which was Burgundy. The unity that was to become France then involved a fusion of the Greco-Roman and Germanic cultures. The descendants of Clovis became known as the Merovingians, named after one of his descendants, Merovius. And more about this line a little bit later. By the middle of the 6th century, from the English Channel to the Pyrenees was Christianized, making up with Italy, Ireland, and a small part of England, the lands of Europe that were the church. A significant churchman in the time in the country of Gaul or France was St. Gregory of Tours. He lived from 538 to 594. He was from a Gallo-Roman senatorial families, and he had connections to most of the aristocratic houses in Gaul. He was the Bishop of Tours in France from 573 to 594. And St. Gregory of Tours is so critical and so important in his time and for medieval Europe, in that he wrote the Historica Francorum, the history of the Franks, from creation until 591. He was a required reading for the history of France at the time. Let's look at the conversion of Spain. Christianity arrived in Spain during the Roman Empire. Spain had the privilege of being converted by St. James the Greater and St. Paul. They both visited the Iberian Peninsula, and the early church there suffered greatly under Roman persecution, while before the early 4th century, when the Roman Empire declared Christianity legal. So there was great persecution up to that time. But by the middle of that 4th century, there was a fairly stable hierarchy of bishops, and it brought pretty good orthodoxy to the faithful. In fact, they even held local councils battling the heresies of the day. However, the Visigoths, the Gothic tribe that invaded and defeated Rome, and the Arian Christians made their way through southern Gaul and conquered the Iberian Peninsula. And they ruled there through the 6th century, when Catholicism was made the official religion around 589. And that came about through this particular story of Saint Hermegild. Saint Hermegild was the eldest son of King Leovigild, who was an Arian, and Queen Ingun, who was a Merovingian Catholic. He had a brother named Record. Saint Hermegild was murdered in 585 after a year in jail in captivity at the hands of his Arian father. Saint Hermegild rejected Arianism in favor of the truth of Christ's identity. Record becomes the king after Hermegild's murder, and he converts to Christianity in 587, setting the stage for the conversion of Spain. In 589, at the Third Council of Toledo, it was a local council, the council condemned Arianism, resulting in Spain becoming a Catholic country in full unity with the papacy. As time went on, by the early 8th century, the temporal and ecclesial unity had degraded, setting the stage for the Muslim invasion of 711. By 714, the Muslims would completely invade the Iberian Peninsula, 3 years that took the Romans 100 years to do. So clearly, the Muslims would become and were quite a formidable enemy. The Catholics in the Iberian Peninsula didn't fully convert, and some would hide in the mountainous regions, as you might expect. But some Christians did live under the Muslim rule, and they were called the Mozarabs. They fared not poorly until the 9th century, but nonetheless did not live a full and rich Christian life. Christian rule in Spain did not return until 1492. Let's talk about the conversion of the Celts. Christianity, when it reached the Irish shores, being so distant from Rome, adapted itself to the Celtic culture. And the greatest story that there is that is recorded in the book is the story of St. Patrick, the Apostle of Ireland. He was born patricius. He was the son of a Roman Briton. He was born around the around the end of the 4th century, and he died around 493 AD. At around 16, he was captured and hauled off to Ireland as a slave for 6 years. He made his way back to Britain, where he experienced a vision calling him back to the people of Ireland. And soon he began his studies for the priesthood. Sometime in the early 430s, the priest, St. Patrick, made his way back to Ireland. He had been commissioned by Pope St. Celestine I to aid the Bishop of Ireland, Palladius, to convert Ireland. On the journey to Ireland, while still in Gaul, St. Patrick was ordained Bishop of Ireland upon learning that Palladius had died. He then sailed to Northern Ireland. Now, Palladius had primarily handled Southern Ireland, and Southern Ireland, right just below, say, the orange line across the middle. He hadn't really touched much of Northern Ireland. So St. Patrick, when he traveled to Ireland, traveled to the northern part of Ireland, and there he encountered great resistance by the Druids. However, as legend has it, St. Patrick's efforts were very great, and all of Northern Ireland became Catholic, as did all of the southern parts of Ireland. He governed from Ulster, the black circle that you see on the country, and he's reputed to be a humble, eloquent miracle worker. Miracles were part of his daily life, as it were. And within a generation of his arriving in Ireland, the entire country was Catholic. Patrick commissioned the foundation of many monasteries, and in 462 he wrote Confession, in which he described his spiritual journey. His feast day is March 17th. The history of Ireland is not complete, though, for us without considering the effect that the Irish monks had on the history of the church. So let's look first a little bit here at the Irish monks. In Ireland, monasticism was formed not under the rule of St. Benedict, the Western rule, but rather the rule of St. Basil. And the Irish monks led an extremely ascetical life. For example, they slept on flagstone floors. They prayed in icy water. They slept in wet blankets because they believed that to deny the body was to free the soul. And one of the comments made is, this asceticism helps explain why the rule of St. Benedict took hold in the West, for it was far less rigorous. But during the 6th and 7th centuries, Irish monasticism enjoyed its greatest influence. Their scriptoria and libraries literally preserved the Greco-Roman traditions. They maintained proficiency in ancient Greek, and by the influx of Greek monks, because of their penchant for the rule of St. Basil, the Greek language was present in Ireland while not in mainland Europe as much. However, the Christian model developed very differently in Ireland. In Ireland, in lieu of parishes, where bishops would rule in a diocese and have parishes underneath them, in Ireland, the monasteries that were formed became the parishes, as it were, and the abbots were the bishops and cared for the people surrounding the monasteries. And so that model of church life was subtly different as it developed in Ireland. But by the 800s, the Irish church influence was waning. Their missionary influence was being driven more by the papacy, not by their own drive for missionary work. There was greater tension in the church on the mainland. And a great burden in the 800s, the Vikings were attacking Ireland and wreaking havoc on their monasteries and the associated countryside. And so the monks retreated of a sort for their very survival. The other thing is, by the 800s, the Germanic people whom they were evangelizing were becoming more firmly Christian, and so their missionary mission was diminishing. So then, let's look at a couple particular saints. Let's first look at St. Columba. St. Columba is the apostle to Scotland. He lived 521 to 597. He was of royal lineage, Irish lineage, the O'Donnells and the O'Neills. The word Columba means dove, yet he wasn't exactly a dove. He founded several monasteries in northern England and Scotland in the Irish tradition. But before he left Ireland, he did found a couple of monasteries there in Durrow and Derby. But he incited a war with High King Diarmait. And the upshot of it is St. Columba was praying on one side for his troops, and St. Finian of Irish repute was praying for King Diarmait's. The authors didn't go into who won the war, but it's interesting, saint against saint in a war. What a time. In any case, ultimately at the end, he was indeed exiled, so clearly St. Diarmait won. He was indeed exiled from Ireland, and he was exiled to Scotland. And it was in Scotland that he founded a monastery on Iona, converted the Picts, wrote 300 books, and was the person who anointed in 574 the new Scottish king, thereby contributing to the eventual conversion of the entire Scottish population. St. Columba, a warrior. Let's look at St. Columbanus. You'll be really happy to know about him. He worked to evangelize the northern coast of France in early 6th and 7th century, the late 6th rather, in the early 7th century, when the faith was waning in France. He's reputed to have been a huge man, and it's said that he was able to kill a bear with his bare hand. And his method of evangelization is he'd get in a boat and float. And wherever he landed, he would preach. In later years, he made his way to Bobbio near Genoa in 612, where he founded a monastery, which later became an important center of learning. He died there in 615. But what did St. Columbanus bring? Here's what they brought to the mainland. In the Irish tradition, okay, the idea was frequent confession was the rule. And it developed in the monastery, but it expanded to the general population over time. Now, it's not to say that confession was an easy thing, or rather, that penance was an easy thing in the context of confession. But in Irish practice of the sacrament of confession, it was quite different, in that you would receive absolution during the course of your penance before you went forth and practiced your penance. Contrast that with the Roman way of penance. By the 3rd century, it was very austere. The penances were rigorous and lengthy, almsgiving and very severe fasting. And absolution was only granted after the public penance was accomplished. And that could be lengthy. And in fact, in the Roman way, penance was understood to be a second baptism. So the practice in the West was that receiving the sacrament of penance was held off, and many waited until the approach of death. Usher in the Irish, and their forms of penance could be severe and the penance lengthy and rigorous. However, absolution was granted during the sacramental event. And so the Irish could recommend and did recommend frequent confession. So the practice of frequent confession with absolution during the sacrament became the rule. And in fact, in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, that's when that model was formalized. And that's when a yearly confession was memorialized as a requirement within the church. So thank you, St. Columbanus, for bringing Irish confession to the continent. Let's look then at England. Oh, there we are. It's not known when the gospel originally entered England, but it is known that the English bishops were present at the Council of Aries in 314 in France. And up through the 6th century, invasions by the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons drove the Christians to the westernmost part of the island. And at this juncture enter St. Augustine of Canterbury. He died sometime between 604 and 609. But in 596, Pope St. Gregory sent St. Augustine with 40 monks to travel by land to reach England. And during their journey, the monks encountered horrific stories about the peoples of England and stopped. They were in Gaul. St. Augustine wrote and asked the Pope for permission to quit. The Pope denied, and they forged on. Upon arrival, St. Augustine found that most of the rumors were indeed exaggerated. And as the model that we talked about in France and in Spain, St. Augustine sought out and found a king with a Christian wife. One of the kings of the 6 kingdoms in England. His name is Ethelbert. He was the king of Kent. And he was married to Bertha, who was the great-granddaughter of King Clovis. Bertha allowed the monks the freedom to preach. Bertha and Ethelbert allowed the monks the freedom to preach, but did not immediately convert. But Bertha at this point had not worked on converting her husband to the faith. But by Christmas Day on 597, some 10,000 souls converted to the faith. The exact date of Ethelbert's conversion is in dispute, but by 601 he had indeed converted. Ethelbert placed St. Augustine in Canterbury, and it became the center of Catholicism in the country. In 601, Augustine was also named Primate Bishop of England. He started the formation of monasteries, and they spread rapidly over the land, taking over the pagan temples, which were then converted into churches. St. Augustine ordained other bishops and sent them to other large population centers. And by the time of his death in the first decade of the 7th century, the Catholic Church had taken very strong roots that it would grow so as to serve the center of Christian Renaissance in the early Middle Ages. And so, after St. Augustine dies, England's mission continues. The faith waxed and waned in England, as you might expect, with one of 6 kingdoms fully abiding in Catholicism, as kings and queens came and believed and not believed. Paganism was very present at the time, and so Catholicism constantly was doing battle with paganism. The Irish missionaries, however, supplemented their effort, and in 655, St. Dusdalf became the first native Archbishop of Canterbury. The Irish missionaries working with the English Catholics to spread the faith. Needless to say, the Irish missionaries brought a Celtic dimension to the faith in their sphere of influence. At the Synod of Whitby in 664, several items were determined because with the Irish influence, there was the Greek penchant for the faith and the Eastern penchant and the Western penchant, and so the Council of Whitby was formed to resolve some of these issues. And in 664, these 2 things would be determined. Number 1, that Easter would be celebrated to coincide with the Roman tradition, and monasticism in England would follow the Benedictine form. And it's attributed to the Bishop of York, St. Wilfrid, to lead the effort in making these decisions. From this point, the Church of England would grow in union with the papacy, and this unity would set the stage for the English missionary zeal to Germany and the Low Country to help with the conversion of Germany, which we'll hear about next week. Finally, one last saint to speak about of great significance is St. Bede. He's called the father of English history. He lived from 673 to 735. He was the most important Anglo-Saxon scholar of his time, and his works were standard subject matter in medieval curriculum. From his own writing, we learn the ecclesial history of the English people. And we learned this about Bede. We learned that he entered the monastery at age 7. He was ordained a deacon at 19, a priest at 30. And we learned that he studied, read, and wrote on Latin grammar, Latin poetry, astronomy, the tides, chronology, biblical commentary, a biography of St. Cuthbert, history, and he provided the accurate rendition and the development of the BC AD calendar distinction. He was titled a venerable within a century of his death, declared a doctor of the church in 1899 by Pope Leo XIII. And sadly, in his ecclesiastical history, he wrote that the English would seriously decline in the faith, and they did so between 800 and 1000 AD, so that at 1000 AD, they were relatively backward as a country. At this point, we've looked at the conversion experiences of these countries, how the faith was brought there and established, and clearly we've glossed over what occurred during the course of the history in each of these countries. A 300-year period can't be covered in 20 minutes. Next week, we'll speak again in a similar fashion about Germany, Scandinavia, and the Slavs. The purpose is to expose us to the exposition of the Catholic faith, the gospel, to the barbarian tribes. Thank you. Have a good day.
Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, dona nobis